I'm Carole Taylor. On this edition of Journal, we ask the question, "Oh, Canada, what has happened to you?" No question, we used to punch above our weight when our beloved country was listened to with respect at the United Nations and around the world. Not so much anymore. Our frayed foreign relations are evident everywhere we look. China, who kept our two Davids in prison for nearly 3 years. India, who for a time suspended all visas with Canada. United States, where 23 U.S. senators recently wrote that they were profoundly disappointed in Canada not meeting its NATO commitments, implying we're freeloaders. Ouch. So where are we now? What is Canada's place in the world? Do we have influence? Justin Trudeau famously said when first elected 9 years ago, "Canada is back." Really? Does anyone believe that? To help analyze our current situation and comment on the way forward, I'm joined by the Honourable James Moore, who was the youngest member of Parliament ever elected in BC at age 24, eventually becoming Minister of Industry under Stephen Harper. Relevant to our discussion, he served in opposition as Deputy Foreign Affairs Critic and in government as Parliamentary Secretary for the Asia-Pacific Gateway. In addition, James was asked by the Trudeau government to be an advisor during the last round of free trade negotiations. He is a respected voice on Canada's international relationships. So lots of experience and much wisdom about what has led to Canada's current challenges. Back in a moment with the Honourable James Moore. Welcome back. James, you have been at the center of so much of international politics behind the scenes and now as an advisor to, first of all, the Canadian government when they were doing the last big free trade government. So before we talk about individual countries, what's your sense of Canada's place in the world these days?
I think people, when you think about Canada in the world, we are very unique in the sense that we're the only country in the world that's a member of the Francophonie and the Commonwealth and NAFTA and NATO and a founder of the UN and Canada-Europe Free Trade Agreement, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, Canada-South Korea Free Trade. We are truly one of the most global countries in the world. And that, on paper, is extraordinarily impressive, presents incredible opportunity. But in a democratic government like ours, in a democratic society like ours, you can only really engage in the world if you're really strong at home. And the truth is, of course, Canada's not doing well. The good news about where we are as a country broadly is that I actually think there's a consensus amongst Canadians about what the problem is and where we are. Not total consensus, but I think there's a broad, large plurality of Canadians who understand where we are.
What is that consensus in your mind?
Which is bad public finances and a struggling economy. We're now in our 8th straight quarter of per capita GDP recession. You know, people can say the economy is growing at 1.5%. No, in real lived experience by everyday Canadians, we're in our 8th straight quarter now of a per capita GDP recession, which is people have less purchasing power than they've had in 2 years, and they're struggling. And so then you have the twin 1-2 punch of rising interest rates, which cannibalizes your take-home pay, and then rising inflation, which is you can buy less with the pay that you do have. And so Canadians are frustrated by the economy. They want a strong, healthy economy because they know that from a strong economy is the foundation from which all other things come. So we have a strong economy, or a weak economy, and a struggling economy, inflation, which means it's hard to buy a home, hard to start a family. Hard to start a family hurts productivity. Then you have to bring in more new Canadians than ever before, which creates an upward pressure on housing prices, which creates some of the stresses that we see in our society around some of the strains that we have in our healthcare system, our transportation system, our schools. And so these things are spinning all around, and Canadians are frustrated. So I think there's a consensus that we know what the problem is. And that's a very good thing, because very often in democracies, people debate about what the problem is. We know what the problem is. A weak economy, which has led to all these other challenges. So Canada's place in the world is therefore challenged. Our our wealth relative to the United States and their ability to control a lot of means of production, attract capital, attract investment, which drains it away from Canada, is all a problem. So our problems are very clear, I think, to most Canadians, and you see that in kind of the consensus view of polls, whereas the Conservatives will say they'll put forward their remedies, but everybody is kind of recognizing what the problems are. New Democrat, Liberals, Conservatives, Pierre Poilievre, Trudeau, they're all saying the same thing, different remedies on the table, but a consensus about what the problem is a healthy thing.
It's interesting how you've tied our economic performance, which is weak, to our voice in the world, because it is hard to go and tell another country what to do if you haven't got your own act together, right?
Yeah, I mean, and you see this sometimes, whether it's Canada asserting its position on what Israel should be doing vis-a-vis Gaza, or what Ukraine should be doing geostrategically relative to Russia. And sometimes I often go on television shows and I hear people saying, Canada must say this, Canada must say that. It's sort of like saying, imagine the Chilean Senate put forward a motion saying we think that Israel say thanks very much, not quite so interested. And, Canada's voice in the world is, we're leaning on a reputation that was earned a very, very long time ago. And we obviously had, heroic and impressive contributions in the war in Afghanistan, post 9/11. But outside of that, when you look at Canada's contributions to the UN, to peacekeeping missions, to our military footprint around the world, to consolidation with the United States on continental security, or our exclusion from some aspects of the Five Eyes combination of security and intelligence sharing, Canada is sort of a shrinking also-ran when it comes to our national security reputation around the world. That's really sad and tragic. And at a certain point, the world is going to start boxing us out. You see the threats from Donald Trump, and where he could go should he become president of the United States again, right, is to say that the Article 5 commitment amongst NATO countries that an attack against one is an attack against all will only apply to countries that make their 2% of GDP commitment to spending on defense, which Canada is nowhere near at that threshold. So Canada, because we have been laggards for so long, we're engaged with the rest of the world through all these historic agreements and relationships, and the ethnic lineage of so many Canadians and our diversity. All that's good, but in real world politics, in the realist world in which we live and operate, Canada is sort of seen as a bystander rather than a leader.
There's so many layers to what you've just said. Part of it is if Trump comes back. When Trump was defeated and Biden won, Canadians across the board seem to be cheering, oh, now everything's going to be a love fest again. And in fact, it has not turned out that way. Very first thing was, we'll cancel the pipeline. Buy American is going into all of their big infrastructure dollars. They're not very happy with us about a number of things. They asked us if we would lead the delegation to Haiti. They asked us to as a favor, and we said, can't do it.
Yeah. We didn't have the capacity, we didn't have the strength, and we didn't have the wherewithal. It's all that is true. And we always remember, the most important relationship around the world, of course, is Canada and the United States. 1 in 5 Canadian jobs is dependent on trade with the United States. We are, in a lot of ways, culturally integrated. We cheer for sports teams in the same sports. We listen to the same music. We speak the same language. Our north-south economic infrastructure is linked. And so we are very much tied to the United States economically, in some ways socially. And when you have a distance from the United States in a way that's growing in terms of people's lived experience, the per capita GDP gap relative to the United States, and then on top of that, as you said, the rising dynamic of American isolationism and protectionism. The biggest isolationist event that happened since the end of the Second World War was Brexit. The second biggest could be what happens to the NAFTA relationship in 2026. It's the biggest public policy fight that's on the horizon for Canada with the most consequences that needs a great deal of thought and introspection.
So give us some sense of how that worked behind the scenes, because you were there for the last free trade negotiations, which obviously weren't easy. They were complicated, but we survived them. Well, what was going on? Did they really care about what Canada was saying?
Yeah, very much so. So, again, context. Justin Trudeau gets elected to a strong majority government in 2015 in October, and then he has a state dinner at the White House with Barack Obama. It's a big love affair going on, and the two administrations are getting along very well. Flip over to 2016, and Hillary Clinton's for sure going to win. No problem, she's going to win. 99% says the New York Times on election day, she's going to win. And then Donald Trump gets elected. And that was a symbol crash moment for an awakening for Justin Trudeau's government, where, you like in a government if you can spend as much time focusing on the proactive things that you want to do to score points in a way that you think is good for the country. And they were immediately put on their heels. So he was elected in November of 16, sworn in early 17. And through the spring of 17, when it was very clear that President Trump was going to renegotiate NAFTA and try to get a better deal for the United States as he saw it, what Prime Minister Trudeau did, I think to his credit, was try to assemble a group of people who had lived in this world of government public policy and Canada-U.S. relations for a while, a diversity of opinion, a diversity of group of people, former Conservative cabinet ministers, myself, Ron Ambrose, former New Democrats, the head of the Assembly of First Nations, some people in the agriculture and cultural sectors and so on. You don't want the group to be too big because then it just becomes a Congress. You actually want them to be sort of nimble and thoughtful and all that. And we met maybe monthly, and as we got down to the tighter strokes of the new NAFTA agreement, we were meeting weekly and having conversations and having direct input to Minister Freeland, who was the lead negotiator on behalf of the Government of Canada. And we got into pretty significant details about what Canada's trade position should be. The government, I think, listened to a broad area of public opinion. We arrived at sort of a consensus view about what a new NAFTA might look like in terms of being adequate for Canada, not as good as the old NAFTA, but adequate in terms of protecting the fundamentals of our access to a 300 million person U.S. market with the largest middle class in the world. For a country of 40 million people, that's pretty consequential, and we were able to do that. The problem with the new NAFTA, of course, is that it's up for renewal in 2026, and so therefore it has to be reasserted and reaffirmed in the countries of the tripartite relationship. And that's a problem not just in Canada and in the United States, but also a problem in Mexico, who is having an election this week.
Yes, a woman's going to win.
Yes, a socialist progressive protege of López Obrador, the incumbent, who is the former mayor of Mexico City, brought in gender-neutral school uniforms for school kids, which I only mention because you can imagine a re-elected Donald Trump getting a pre-brief on a free trade agreement about who his counterparts are and what his reaction may be.
We'll continue with that interesting thought in just a moment. We'll be right back. Welcome back. And so let's continue with this talk about the U.S.-Canada relations, because this 2026 negotiations on free trade is so vitally important.
Yeah.
Do you think we're going to be successful, or are we going to be giving up more ground?
I think we'll be okay. The question is, what is the future of the NAFTA tripartite relationship, Canada, U.S., and Mexico? Mexico has an election coming up. The new Mexican president, who is likely to be a protege of López Obrador, is to the left, also an isolationist. And the dynamic in Mexico is really interesting. We often talk, we talk about U.S. politics because it's in our face. Again, we speak the same language, we consume the same media, and so we can have a pretty literate view of what's happening in American politics as Canadians. But in Mexico, because of those language barriers and the dynamic and the culture there is quite different. But in Mexico, like, a lot's going on there. There's clearly, the border wall question with Canada, or with Mexico and the United States, is intensifying in American politics, because you have, California, which sort of skews the policy debate to the left, and you have Texas, which skews the policy debate to the right. Then you have a swing state of Arizona right there. So the politics of border security in the United States has been weaponized for domestic politics quite aggressively. On top of that, in Mexico, you have a massive footprint now of Chinese investment, of manufacturing capacity in Mexico that is Chinese-owned, Chinese-based in Mexico, that is flooding Chinese goods into the U.S. market, North American marketplace through Mexico in a way that nobody had previously seen. So again, if you're an American policymaker and you're going into 2026 after the presidential election, imagine President Trump's been elected. You're going into the midterms of 2026 after the 24 campaign. And Mexico is sitting there wanting to have a reaffirmed NAFTA relationship with the United States. The politics, it sort of spells itself out, right? From the left and from the right. On the left, you could say, we can't have a new NAFTA renegotiate with Mexico because look at the manufacturing jobs that are being lost to Mexico because China has supplanted itself and put a massive footprint into Mexico. And on the right, you'll have people saying, we cannot have a NAFTA with Mexico because look at the border security situation. Fentanyl is crossing the border, crime is coming across the border, it's destabilizing our border towns. We need to shut this thing down. And then Canada is going to come along and say, hey, let's renegotiate NAFTA with Mexico. Well, I mean, I think Canada needs to rethink maybe what our position should be. And again, the trade relationship in North America began under Brian Mulroney as an FTA, Canada and the United States. Prime Minister Chrétien picked up the torch from Brian Mulroney and added Mexico into it and expanding it to NAFTA. But the original FTA of just Canada and the United States becomes now a very interesting option should all of that play out as I just described.
One of the things I wonder about, yes, there are the pieces on the table, whether it's dairy or lumber or whatever, those pieces are part of the negotiations, but there's an influence from Congress and the Senate in the states in terms of whether they are keen on Canada or could care less. What did you think about the letter that 23 U.S. senators sent saying they were so discouraged with Canada's position on not fulfilling our NATO 2%?
They have said it, those senators and others have said those kinds of comments through social media in the past. Whenever there was a G7 or G20 meeting or even a North American leaders meeting with President Trump was there, Marco Rubio would say these kinds of things, Ted Cruz would say these kinds of things. They're not wrong in terms of substance from their perspective. They're not necessarily wrong. But the idea of an American legislator commenting on Canada's domestic legislative process is not diplomatically typical. I mean, imagine the Minister of Environment in Canada, writing a letter to the New York Times or the Washington Post or doing a media tour and condemning the way in which the congressional budget process. There's a bit of a boundary there, but there's an agreement between all NATO countries that you would have 2% of you would get on a trajectory to increase military spending to 2% of GDP. Canada has fallen behind that, and we're scaling down from it, not trying to close that vector over time. And so, as a NATO ally, and as Prime Minister Trudeau in the past was going around the world trying to, through global platforms, trying to sort of bank shot a message into the United States of put more money into the defense of Ukraine against Russia's aggression. It's if you're going to preach, you better have moments where you listen to. And so Justin Trudeau has been pretty self-righteous about what the rest of the world should do in different places of the world. He better start, getting accustomed to a diplomatic anormality of American legislators telling him that he better start anteing up.
Well, and this is worrisome for Canadians because I think our voice used to have some solidity to it. And now in many places we're a bit of a joke. One column this past week said that NATO regards us as a laughingstock now. And Trump has, as you've said, if you're not paying your 2%, we're not defending you.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of this is hyperbole, but really there's something there that's saying, if you're not willing to step up, then we're not going to pay much attention to you.
Yeah, I mean, the old, Cold War line, right, walk softly, carry a big stick. I mean, we're walking loudly and carrying nothing. And you look at the defense of the Arctic, which is really nothing, right? I mean, I've been up to the far north and been up to Pond Inlet and seen some of our rangers up there. I mean, these are kids in hoodies with Lee Enfield rifles. That's our northern defense, right? And you look at our search and rescue capacity. You look at the reach that we have into the Arctic with our naval fleet. It's non-existent. Like it's wide open and that's a real cause for concern when you see the transgressions and the aggression of Vladimir Putin, and you see the resources that are going to become available on the seafloor of the North as a result of climate change. Like the North is going to become a real place for, I think, tension and focus for Canadians.
What's your opinion about our leadership, a prime minister that goes around the world lecturing other countries, lecture China about the Uyghurs, or lecturing India about something, he even went to Italy and lectured them, and they did a very disrespectful title on one of their tabloids about, we're going to listen to this guy?
Yeah.
It has to backfire, doesn't it?
It also wears thin, right? I mean, the self-righteousness and indignation of Justin Trudeau, pointing out other people's failings when his are quite manifest, right? When it comes to moral leadership, ethical governments, putting money where your mouth is in terms of expectations of policy and so on. I think it wears very thin. I mean, I can imagine if Donald Trump were to be reelected this fall, and then he turns around and sees that Justin Trudeau is still there for another year. That's not a relationship that's obviously been curated in the best interests of Canadians. And there's, I suppose, blame on both sides of that. But I also think that as Justin Trudeau gets more and more desperate, and this is a real cause for concern, if Donald Trump were to be reelected this fall in the United States, and then you still have a calendar year until Justin Trudeau goes for reelection, should he offer again, then unlike in the past, I think Justin Trudeau, because he's so desperate, could have an open political rhetorical war with the President of the United States for the sake of domestic politics. Because his ceiling of support is so low that he needs to get progressives in the tent in order to have a chance of forming even a minority government. So those NDP Liberal switch voters who would love to see the Prime Minister of Canada get into a fight with Donald Trump over any issue, you name it, whether it's LGBTQ rights or the woman's right to choose and Roe v. Wade and the Supreme Court tilt or what have you, they would love to see it. And I wonder if Justin Trudeau could be so desperate for his own political salvation that he would risk the Canada-U.S. relationship by further burning his relationship with Donald Trump. I mean, it's a real concern.
Not a pretty picture we're painting here.
Well,
So if you're Prime Minister today,
yeah.
is this situation where we've got frayed relationships everywhere, is it reparable, or how do you go about changing that?
Yeah, I mean, in the fullness of time, I think things settle and people want, peace, order, and good government. And I think in Canada, because, ending where we began, right, we do have this global footprint. We just still do have a global reputation that is strong. I think the stain that has happened or the stresses that have emerged in recent history actually are more circumscribed around the personality of Justin Trudeau. And I think people can disaggregate liking and disliking Justin Trudeau as a personality and still believing in Canada as a country that is stable, rule of law, respectful, progressive in the right ways, responsible in the right ways, and forward-leaning and a trusted ally when times are tough for our friends and partners around the world. Just as I think the vast majority of Canadians like the United States, they like Americans, they like what they see in the United States, they like the partnership with the United States, but they can really dislike Donald Trump, or they can really dislike certain elements of American society, but still believe in whole that this is a great country that is a friend and ally. So
in a word or two, are you optimistic or pessimistic?
Short term, no, I'm optimistic, because it's the North American platform that has created the greatest wealth generation in the history of humanity, is so strong and so healthy and so fundamental to the well-being of everybody that I think people will rally around at the end of the day.
Perfect note to end on. Thank you, James. James Moore. We'll be back in a moment. So where does Canada stand internationally? I think it's fair to say that our overall influence and power has diminished. Our military has been allowed to fall behind in equipment and manpower to the point that NATO can't count on us to meet our commitments. As well, our pious lecturing to many other countries about their internal policies hasn't helped. Let me know your thoughts on YouTube. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.